This is the Chapter 25 outline, America and the Great War, and I did this outline over the course of like a week. I just did a couple pages each day because I was too lazy to finish the day before. So I'm probably not going to remember a lot of this beginning stuff, so it's going to be a lot of like reading off of the outline and not being able to give a lot of more extra information. But anyway, so basically in this chapter is World War I. In the 1800s, America was isolated from the wars of Europe because they were on their separate continent. In the 1900s, the isolation ends because America is now involved in world trade. There are steam-powered ships, so the ocean isn't that big of a barrier anymore. Submarines, once again, ocean's not that big of a barrier anymore. And the president during this whole entire chapter is Woodrow Wilson, and he feels the need to share America's greatness, so he's going to be all up in Europe. Wilson and Foreign Affairs and idlest diplomacy. So Wilson didn't have any foreign affairs experience, and it's kind of funny because his whole entire presidency was based off of foreign affairs, but he wanted to create a new world order based on morality, so that's him wanting to spread America into Europe. And his Secretary of State was William Jennings Bryan, still hasn't gone away yet. He said it was his religious duty to spread democracy, because remember, he's all religious and he relates everything back to religion. So the two of them set up 30 cooling-off treaties, which in Europe, which were pretty much just treaties between two nations promising not to go to war for the next 12 months. They had no effect because World War I happened. Intervention in Mexico. From 1876 to 1910, Pacifico Diaz was the military dictator of Mexico. But then Francisco Madero led a rebellion, but then one of his guys that supported him through the rebellion, General Victoriano Huerta, took power from Madero. And so Wilson refuses to recognize Huerta's government because he stole it from Madero. And Wilson started to remove an arms embargo on Mexico, saying that they couldn't trade. They wouldn't trade guns because they didn't want to help Mexico's government. But now he removes that in order to give supplies to the new rebels, who are called the Constitutionalist Party. They're led by something Carranza. So, Wilson also sent U.S. warships to stop naval shipments from reaching Huerta. So, that was on the west coast of Mexico. He set up a trade blockade. And when that happened, some U.S. sailors actually accidentally got too close to Mexico, so the Mexican Navy was like, whoa, what's going on, because they didn't know about it or whatever. And so the U.S. soldiers were arrested, and then they figured out that they were U.S. soldiers and like that they were going to get pooped on real hard if they didn't release the soldiers, so they released them. But then the naval officer, who just got done being arrested by the Mexicans, demanded that the Mexicans salute the American flag, and the Mexicans obviously weren't going to do that. And then Woodrow Wilson was like, oh yeah, I think they should salute the Mexican flag, which is stupid. And they obviously refuse, so he sends an army into Veracruz, Mexico, and just to kind of like fight the Mexicans and punish them. 19 Americans were killed, but 200 Mexicans were killed during this. And Wilson thinks that the American army is going to go in there and be viewed as liberators, but because the new government, which was the previous rebel government, Wilson thinks that the Mexican people don't like that government, but the Mexicans are like, ew, go away. And Huerta actually gets more support. And the ABC powers have to propose to remove Americans and remove Huerta and set up a provisional government because stuff wasn't going to end well. And the ABC powers, it's Argentina, something, and Colombia. I should probably... some South American country that begins with B. That's really... Brazil. Wow, I'm stupid. Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia. Okay, so America leaves and Carranza becomes president. So went from dictatorship to democracy. But then groups of bandits started to form, and the famous one was led by Pancho Villa. and Pancho Villa led attacks on America, hoping to make Americans attack the Mexican government and have. So he's attacking Carranza's government. So then the U.S. Army will defeat Carranza, and then Pancho Villa will take power. So he's kind of trying to get the Americans to fight for him. And so Wilson gets Carranza's permission to go into Mexico and find Pancho Villa. So he was hoping that Wilson would go and attack Carranza, but instead he's like, I know Pancho Villa is doing this, so can I go into Mexico and attack Pancho Villa? And Pancho Villa's like, crap. And so, and they're led by General Pershing, and he chases Pancho Villa, but then he all throughout North Mexico, but then he withdraws the search in 1917 because World War I. The U.S. enters World War I, and Carranza set up a constitution. Okay. Other problems in Latin America, there were U.S. Marines in Nicaragua, in Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, and so Latin America pretty much hates America now. And this is just kind of going over the order of power. Military dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, then it went to Francisco Madero, who freed them from that guy, but then Huerta took it from this guy. Wilson says, we're not going to recognize your government. So then, I think I just said that Carranza went from a military dictator to president, but the ABC powers removed Huerta from power and has a military dictator and put Carranza into power as a president. Okay, an uneasy neutrality. So Wilson's wife dies, and then he remarries right away. So he's all like, "Oh, I'm so sad," and then he's like, "Wait, just kidding." So no one could have predicted World War I, and now we get into World War I. So Serbian kills Archduke Ferdinand, and he's Archduke of Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary wants to punish Serbia, and so they send out in an army into Serbia, and then Russia's like, no, all Slavs need to stick together, so Russia goes to defend Serbia. Then all these alliances form. See notebook for a list of powers. Mr. Smith gave us those notes in class. So Germany is fighting against Russia to support Austria-Hungary, because Germany thinks that all Dutch/Germans should stick together. And so then Germany starts, and Russia's ally is France, so Germany starts fighting France because Russia is Germany's enemy, and so they're fighting their allies too. So Germany fights. So Germany has to go through Belgium though to get to France. Well, they don't have to, but they want to take them by surprise. So Belgium, who is an ally with Britain, lets Britain know what's going on, and so Britain's like, no, just get out of Belgium. So now the British are against the Germans, and Japan wants to fight against the Germans to get the German territories in Asia, because they're like, oh, you know what, if we say that we're going against the Germans, and then when the Germans are weak, we can take their Asian territories. The Ottoman Empire joins Germany and Austria-Hungary for financial reasons that aren't specified in the book. World War I, just a bit about it. There were a lot of new weapons. It was the first industrialized war. Lots of machine guns, landmines, aerial bombs, and poison gas, which was a new thing in warfare. And it was basically, all of it was trench warfare and pointless. Initial reactions. So the American government remains neutral, but the American people aren't neutral because a lot of them are immigrants from either side. There are the Irish, who are going to be anti-British, so therefore they're pro-German. A lot of Germans. There's a lot of British people there. There's a lot of French people there, so internal conflictions, kind of. A strained neutrality. So America tries not to give loans to the warring nations in an attempt to stay neutral. The American economy starts to suffer, so they start to give out loans to both sides. And the war pretty much starts to come down to the person who can survive the war is the person who has the access to the most supplies. So, William Jennings Bryan makes the Declaration of London, which reduces the list of banned goods, or like wartime goods, so that way they can sell more. It also makes blockades legal, and it was accepted, so less goods were banned, so that increases trade, but blockades were going to be formed by both sides. So the British declare the North Sea a war zone, and they start searching neutral ships, and then they bring them back to British ports if they have war materials, and then they buy the war materials from them. And neutral rights and submarines. So now we see what the Germans did, but the British blacklisted U.S. companies, and they would censor mail, so the Americans were trying to remain neutral, but the British just were trying to do stuff to make them not help the Germans in any way. The Germans go the completely violent route and say that they're going to sink all neutral and pro-ally ships. So, a German sub sinks the U.S. ship, the Lusitania. The U.S. demands for Germans to stop sub-warfare and repay for the ship. And Germany says that the only reason they shot it was because it was secretly armed, which it was not. That's why there's an X. And it was carrying contraband, which it was, but they had no way of knowing that, so they kind of just guessed. And Bryant, freaks out, and he's like, you know what, no. And he just resigns, yeah. And the Germans accidentally sink the Arabic, which was another American ship. That was against orders, because Germany said don't sink any more American ships because we're going to get in trouble. Then the officers on that sub were like, you know what, we don't care. So now the Germans had to make the Arabic pledge, which said that subs are going to give notice and allow for people on boats to get onto lifeboats before the submarines destroyed the ships. And so, but that was only for American ships. But there were 2 Americans on a French ship called the Sussex, and they were killed. And so Germans had made the Sussex Pledge, which was to abandon sub-warfare. So Arabic Pledge is they're going to let neutral ships know when they're about to die, and the Sussex Pledge is we're just going to stop. Okay, the debate on preparedness. America made the National Security League, which was a bunch of people who want a bigger military just in case we go to war, which we did, so it was a good idea. But others in the South and West have a distrust of a standing army because of what happened with the Civil War. And they think that they're going to try to take their rights because the North kind of controls the army. That's where the capital is. So the National Defense Act of 1916 slowly starts to increase the army size. The Naval Construction Act of 1916 rapidly makes a big Navy increase. And the Revenue Act of 1916 it increases the income tax, especially on the wealthy, to fund the military and the war. The election of 1916, Charles Evan Hughes was the Republican, and the Populists also voted for him. Did I say PP? Yeah, Populist Party. I think that's what it is. You might want to check on that. I might be wrong, probably, because the Populists are normally going to go Democrat. Woodrow Wilson's the Democrat. Obviously, we know he's going to win. And his whole platform was keeping the U.S. out of the war, which he didn't do. And he wanted to start a post-League of Nations, which he did. And he also wanted women's suffrage. The last efforts for peace, Wilson tries to negotiate with European powers, but Germany starts unrestricted sub-warfare. They just go killing everything. And America starts to break diplomatic ties with Germany because they're like, you know what, you're being a douche. U.S. arms merchant... Oh, and so now the U.S. starts to arm merchant ships because they want to protect them from the unrestricted sub-warfare. And the thing that set the Americans over the edge was the Zimmerman Note, which was a note that the Germans sent to the Mexicans saying, if the U.S. and Germany go to war, Germany will help Mexico invade and reconquer Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. And so at that time, the Russian government had just fallen. And so the U.S. joins the war to fight Germany and to help Russia get democracy. They're like, oh, Russia's falling and we want to be on their side to help them get democracy. So their side is conveniently against the Germans. But they got communism anyway with the Bolshevik Revolution. Okay, America's entry into the war was almost a unanimous decision in the House and Senate, and German subs keep sinking U.S. merchant ships, so that's another reason for entering. America's early role, America had an underdeveloped navy, but they put mines in the North Atlantic Ocean to stop the submarines, because the warships obviously aren't going to be able to reach as deep as mines. Warships are now accompanying merchant ships to protect the also armed merchant ships, and now they're only giving financial loans to France and Britain, not Germany. And General Pershing, the same guy who was was in Mexico, arrives in France with troops, and they start a draft for this war, mobilizing a nation. So the government takes over the economy during the wartime. They also passed the Army Appropriation Act, which sets up the Council of National Defense, which makes the lever or level? That's lever. Okay. Lever Food and Fuel Control Acts, which was just a food administration, which worked on ways to conserve food and fuel. They also encouraged victory gardens. War Industries Board. So they also create the War Industries Board, led by Bernard Baruch, and the government what this sets up is the government is the only buyer of war materials, and they can set production quotas for factories, and they can shoddy raw materials and fix problems, or fix prices. Obviously, they're going to fix problems. Try. So they're basically taking over the economy, a new labor force. So America stops immigration, and there are men leaving for war. So there's a labor shortage, so women and African Americans start to fill in. So the Great Migration refers to blacks who move from the rural south to urban north, and goes the same with Mexicans, except the Mexicans aren't considered part of the Great Migration, and the blacks are moving up to fill the labor shortage, and they leave the South to find jobs, and they go above the Mason-Dixon line, which has no Jim Crow laws, so there's not as much segregation in the North. There's still discrimination, though, as we see later with race riots. Still some race riots against white. That shouldn't be against white. That should be against blacks. The whites were doing the race riots against the blacks. So, and then women, they were needed for work, and they were encouraged to return to their stereotypical work after the war, and they were told from the get-go, once the war's over, get back to being a housewife. Woodrow Wilson supported women's suffrage, though, because he said that if the women support the war, which they did, then he would support women's suffrage. So, win-win. War propaganda. There's set up the Committee of Public Information, which they decided that the best thing to do would be to inform the public about the war and make them anti-German instead of censor them. And so what they did was, their main thing was to set out 4 Minutemen, which was a massive group of men who gave speeches on Liberty Bonds and food and fuel conservation. Okay, civil liberties, obviously it's wartime, so there's a lot of American nationalism, and Germans were viewed as disloyal, so America stopped doing a lot of German things. There was a lot of prejudice towards immigrants. They stopped playing music from Bach and Beethoven because that was German music, and they stopped teaching the German language in schools. Espionage and Sedition Acts, this was to suppress criticism of government leaders, and it also said it was illegal to give support to the enemy or interfere with the war or refuse to go into the draft, and it's illegal to interfere with war bonds. And this pretty much just targeted socialists who were like, oh, this is our time to revolutionize America, blah, 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 because the American government was like, no, we're fighting a war, we don't need a revolution here, because that's what happened to Russia, and America entered the war because the Allies were losing, because Russia had to go under a revolution. America at war, Bolshevik Revolution drops Russia out of the war, and so now the fighting is all focused on the French and German border instead of the Austria-Hungary-Russia border. The Western Front. The Germans are trying to invade France and Belgium before America arrives, so there's lots of fighting and battles, which the book talks about, which aren't that important, which I don't think we'll need to know for the AP exam. Okay, the Bolsheviks. The war causes distrust for a republic government in Russia. Sorry, I'm adjusting the camera a lot. Lenin and the communist Bolsheviks take over the government, and the Germans and anti-Bolsheviks are fighting against Russia, but then the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is between the Russians and Germans, the Russian Bolsheviks and Germans. So now the Russians are saying, because the anti-Bolsheviks were obviously fighting against the Russian government, so the Germans are obviously going to want to fight against the Russian government, but then this treaty says that Russia's withdrawn from the war, so Germany's like, oh, we don't care now. But they also send American troops to eastern Russia to make sure everything's going good or something, but it doesn't really go good. Because they turn communist. 14 points, these are 14 points presented from Woodrow Wilson to Congress. No one knows why the war is being fought right now. There are a lot of, this isn't part of the 14 points, this is, but there are a lot of secret British and French agreements for land after the war. So, 14 points made by Woodrow Wilson, Congress. Point 1 was open diplomacy instead of secret treaties, like what British and France were doing. Freedom of the seas, removal of trade barriers, reduction of armaments, impartial adjustment of victors' colonial claims, so whoever wins gonna get more land. 6 through 12 talked about how the Central Powers had to evacuate occupied lands and allow these countries to set up their own governments. So that'd be stuff like Poland. Which leads us to point 13, which is an independent Poland. And point 14 was set up a League of Nations, kind of like the United Nations. Same exact thing, except the League of Nations fails in the end. And there was also African Americans in America wanted him to add a 15th point, said to end racial discrimination, but he said no. Kind of funny. So some reasons for the 14 points. 1 was to keep Russia in the war. 2, Allied powers were now fighting for a noble cause. They're like, oh, we have these 14 points that we can specifically say we're fighting for. They want to separate the Central Powers from their people, because if the people of the Central Powers saw what the Americans were fighting for, they'd be like, those are all good things. So they're trying to do that. So now the British are demanding limiting freedom of the seas, though. And the French want reparations for war damages. And all the German allies quit the war. Austria-Hungary, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire. They're all like, you know what, we're done. And so on 11/11/1918, at 11/11, Germany quit the war, and they now became the Republic of Germany. This was armistice. They pulled back troops. They surrendered their naval fleet and railroads. The fight for peace, there's domestic unrest, with Wilson leaving because he went to France to talk about treaties and stuff like that. So he was the first president to leave the U.S. while in office. And in the meantime, there were problems at home, like wheat prices were high, there was inflation, and Wilson, the Republicans supported the war, but Wilson told America to elect a Democratic Congress because they'll agree with him. But then the Republicans got elected, and so now they're pissed off because they think that Woodrow Wilson is against them. The Paris Peace Conference is controlled by Britain, U.S., Italy, and France. Everyone wanted different things, and it goes through what every single person wants, but it doesn't matter because none of them got it. Everyone declared, and they pretty much established that all of us have declared war on Germany at some point, and we now all have bad political ties with Germany. So Woodrow Wilson's solution is the League of Nations, and Woodrow Wilson really wants it. He's willing to give up everything to get this. And some things of the League of Nations, the nations involved in the League will impose military and economic sanctions on aggressors. It's kind of a giant alliance. Big Five were the British, U.S., France, Italy, and Japan. And then there are 4 other nations who weren't part of the Big Five, but these 9 together would make an executive council. There would be a permanent court of international justice, and with this, military action would be unnecessary, even though it says that their nations would use military and economic sanctions on aggressors. And Roosevelt is really angry because he doesn't like this because it's showing internationalism over nationalism, and he's all like America. Territory and reparations, some results of the war. The Rhineland, which was an area between France and Germany, had to be demilitarized for 15 years. The fallen nations include Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. Poland got access to the sea now. If you look on the map, you see Germany, Poland. A little up here in the corner, there's more Germany. That's because Germany used to block Poland from the sea, but because of this war, Poland gets a little sliver of land that gives them Germany wasn't willing to give up all that land. They gave them a little sliver, and then Germany surrounds them. And Germany had to pay for all war damages, and this really pisses off Germany, and this plays a big role in World War II and their entrance into the war, and the Nazi Party getting into power. Yeah, and the Germans obviously didn't want to do this, but then the League of Nations was like, listen. It wasn't the official League of Nations yet, but they were like, listen, if you don't do this, we're going to move troops into the Rhineland, and then Germany was like, fine, whatever. Okay, Wilson's lost at home. Some politicians like the League of Nations, but they weren't, like, really enthusiastic about it. They're like, oh yeah, League of Nations sounds like a good idea, and then there's other people like, this is the worst idea ever, blah, blah, blah. So Wilson thinks that these people who are like, this is the worst idea ever, though, are ignorant, and they weren't powerful enough to actually create a strong enough opposition to the League of Nations. German, Italian, and Irish immigrants stopped supporting Wilson because of the League of Nations, because he's like selling out on America, because they moved to America and now they feel American, and all of a sudden they're allying and becoming like one with these other countries, and they're like, no. He really doesn't want anyone to touch Article X, which was part of the League of Nations, which talked about that earlier, which is that there be collective military and economic action against aggressors in the participating nations. So Wilson went on a tour of the U.S. promoting the League of Nations. Then Congress hates it, not hit. And there are three groups on the status of League of Nations. Are the Wilsonians, who are like, yeah, League of Nations is good, and make sure you don't touch Article X, because Article X was like his baby. There were the reservationists who were like, oh yeah, the League of Nations is okay, but we have to change Article X, and they were like, no. Then there's the irreconcilables who were like, no, League of Nations isn't going to happen, and the League of Nations didn't really happen, so they won. Congress declared that war was over on May 20th, 1920, but then Woodrow Wilson was just a douche and was like, nope, it's not over yet, and because he wanted the League of Nations, he said that the war wasn't over until the League of Nations was passed in Congress, but then his term ends, and then Congress is like, okay, now the war's over. And I didn't write on the back of that page. Now we're on page 12. Lurching from war to peace. Now that we're in a peacetime economy, the Spanish flu killed 22 million worldwide in 1918. 675,000 Americans were killed from it. I think said 2,000 were killed in September. It might have been 1,000 Americans killed in 1 month. But U.S. soldiers brought it home with them, and Mr. Smith talked a bit about at Liberty Bond rallies. That's where it really spread. There was a short-lived pandemic, though. The economic transition. Consumer prices were rising, and there were a lot of strikes, which were now legal, which were illegal during the war. The American Federation of Labor is trying to organize steel workers into a strike, but they end up failing. And a really notable thing, like when you think end of World War I and how America reacted, think the Boston police strike, because that was a big strike. Okay, there's racial friction. The summer of 1919 was known as Red Summer, and red for blood. There's suspicions of a black man and a white woman, singular, having sexual relations. There's a lot of suspicion of black men beating white women. There were huge race riots, and the biggest one was the Chicago race riot, and there were a lot of blacks killed and a lot of blacks injured. I wrote down the numbers, but then I figured those weren't actually important because we don't need to memorize those for the AP. The Red Scare. This was the communist scare in America. So the race riots and strikes mirrored the chaos of the time that the Bolshevik Party took over Russia. And so socialists in America are also trying to take over. They're like, oh, it worked in Russia when there was chaos. Chaos in America, let's try to take over. And so they start the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party in the United States. And the Communist Party starts sending bombs in mail. And the government's like, you know what, no, we're not turning communist because that's anti-American. So they start hunts to deport radical immigrants, and they targeted the Union of Russian Workers because they were generally socialists or communists, and they targeted, obviously, the socialists. This recording was under 30 minutes, yay.